Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dollar Dialogue, Episode 6, the new great game China's String of Pearls versus India's Necklace of Diamonds. Imagine controlling the world's busiest trade routes without firing a single shot. Today, around 80% of global trade by volume travels by sea, and much of it passes through the Indian Ocean. Whoever influences these shipping lanes doesn't just move the cargo, they are able to influence energy supplies, international trade, and the entire global economy. Over the last 2 decades, China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars building ports, railways, and infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe through its Belt and Road Initiative. Critics argue that these investments have also created what is known as a string of pearls, a network of strategically located ports stretching across the Indian Ocean. India, however, hasn't stood still. In response, it has strengthened partnerships and expanded its own network of ports, naval access agreements, and regional relationships, an approach often referred to as a necklace of diamonds. So, was this simply economic development, or was this a 21st century geopolitical competition playing out throughout infrastructure instead of military conquest? In today's episode, we'll break down what China's Belt and Road Initiative actually is, examine the ports that make up the string of pearls, explore why the Indian Ocean has become one of the world's most valuable economic regions, and understand India's strategic response through the necklace of diamonds. And finally, we'll answer the biggest question of all: who is actually winning this competition, and what does it mean for the future of global trade? Before we begin, we're excited to welcome our amazing guest for today's episode, Mr. Sambhav Maurya. Sambhav is a student with a strong interest in business, economics, and strategy. He currently finished his extended essay in business management a year ago and has gained practical experience working with Prayas, a juvenile focused NGO. There, he helped manage the organization's finances while also leading in its marketing and promotional campaigns. Under those efforts, Mr. Sambhav Maurya and the NGO were able to raise over 2 lakh rupees in donations in just 1 month. Mr. Sambhav, would you like to say anything else to introduce yourself?
I would just say welcome to Dollar Dialogue, and I hope you guys enjoy this episode. And beyond academics, I've just been involved in community services, etc. So maybe I might not have knowledge compared to my peers such as Supreet and Zumar, but then I'll try my best to maybe find the solution or maybe find the exact answer to the questions we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sambhav. Amazing to have you here with us today. And also, we have ecstatic and exceptional guest speakers here, Mr. Zumar Sheikh, Mr. Demir Hossain. Unfortunately, Mr. Zohan Rana and Mohammed Araf Kabir are both very sick. I believe they might be in the hospitals. Please pray for them, viewers. Thank you very much. And Mr. Zumar Sheikh, would you like to uh, begin with segment one, understanding the Belt and Road Initiative? And can you just tell us all about this?
Yes, of course, Supri. Thank you so much for giving me the torch. And Sambhav, welcome to the podcast. I really miss you. I miss seeing you every day at school. So it's an honor
I,
to have
I also miss you guys, bro. It's been so long, but then hey, we are here, right?
you. So before we're able to understand the growing rivalry between China and India, it's important to first understand the policy that sits at the heart of China's global strategy, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, or commonly referred to as a BRI. It was announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013, and the initiative has been growing into one of the largest infrastructure and investment programs in modern history, with China investing in ports, railways, highways, energy projects, industrial zones, and digital infrastructure across more than 150 countries. For many developing nations, these investments have created new opportunities for trade, improved connectivity, accelerated economic development by addressing long-standing infrastructure gaps, and at the same time, the initiative has generated significant international debate. While China presents the Belt Road Initiative as a platform for mutual economic cooperation and shared prosperity, others argue that it has also strengthened China's political influence and strategic presence in key regions around the world. Because of its scale, the global reach, the Belt and Road Initiative has become one of the one of the defining features of China's foreign and economic policy. Understanding its objectives, both economical and strategic, is essential, as it provides the foundation for many of the developments and regional rivalries that we'll be exploring throughout today's discussion. And Sambhav, since you are an expert in this topic, I just wanted to ask you a question here. With that context in mind, the things that I said, the Belt and Road Initiative is often described as one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in modern history. But what exactly is it, and what were China's main economic and strategic motivations for launching it back in 2013?
Okay. That's a good question. I mean, to be honest, I would like to say that the Belt and the Road Initiative, it was often called as the BRI. It was essentially like China's biggest global infrastructure project. Like, it was launched by President Jinping in 2013 and with a simple but ambitious idea, which was to connect China more closely with the rest of the world by building ports, like railways, highways, power plants, pipelines, and other major infrastructure. Today, the initiative it stretches across more than 150 countries, making it one of the largest development projects like ever undertaken. But the real question is, why did China decide to launch something this massive? Economically, China had a few major reasons. Around 2013, like the economy wasn't growing at the same pace it has been for decades. Industries like steel, cement, and construction had produced more than China itself. So instead of letting those industries slow down, China looked outward. By funding infrastructure projects in other countries, Chinese companies could continue building, exporting materials, creating jobs, and finding new markets. It wasn't about helping other countries develop, but it was also about like keeping China's own economy moving. The BRI also made trade more efficient. Like if you are the world's largest like exporter, having faster shipping routes and better connected ports, it's a huge advantage, right? Building infrastructure abroad makes it easier, cheaper, and quicker for Chinese goods to reach more global markets around the world. Now, beyond economics, there was also like a more strategic reason. So China imports a huge amount of oil and natural gas, and most of it passes through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow shipping route that many experts see as a potential vulnerability. If that route were ever blocked again during a conflict, China's economy would have faced serious issues. So by investing in ports, and pipelines and these transport corridors across different regions, China sort of diversified its trading routes and reduced that risk. And the BRI also kind of give China greater influence on the global stage. When a country finances major infrastructure projects, it naturally builds stronger and political and economical relationships with those countries. China argues that the initiative is about mutual development and creating a win-win situation for everyone involved. However, critics believe it also expands Beijing's strategic influence in key regions around the world. So, in reality, the Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about building roads and ports. It's about economics, trade, energy security, and global influence, which is sort of all combined, or as I say, rolled into one. That's why many experts see it as one of the most important geopolitical projects of the 21st century. That's all I would say about it.
Yes. So building on what Samav perfectly articulated, something I wanted to pose to the group is, do we think that the Belt and Road Initiative, with its numerous values in increased infrastructure, potential long run economic growth, is worth the limitations of the potential supply shocks and potential cost push inflation because of what may occur if one of these straits, such as the Strait of Malacca, were to close? Supreet or Samav, what are your thoughts on the limitations of the Strait of Malacca and its potential of leading to cost push inflation in comparison to the values of this Belt and Road Initiative?
I think what you've posed is a really good question, Demir. And before I pass the mic on to Sambhav, I just wanted to say, since I'm also Indian, Sambhav is also Indian, it's important to look at this question from different perspectives. From China's perspective, of course, the BRI is a long-term investment in reducing the economic vulnerability, because even though, like you said, if one of the streets were to close, then a lot of trade would stop. But with China's BRI uh, partnerships and investment, they're able to use other streets, they're able to use different ports and try to uh, get overcome any unforeseen circumstances as such. And uh, BRI is able to reduce this risk. However, what you also mentioned is also interesting, because there's also a case against it, because the BRI is extremely expensive, and also the BRI does not necessarily eliminate the choke point risk, even though there are many other routes that the ships can take because of this BRI initiative. The thing is, if one of the major straits were to close, like the Strait of Malacca or Strait of Hormuz, it still would cause shockwaves across the world. And China would also suffer from the increased costs of transporting longer distances. And I would say economically, the BRI is justified for China. I'm not sure about how it would be for the rest of the people. So, Mr. Maurya, what do you think about this? And do you know what you could say from India's perspective?
Yeah, maybe I can elaborate in this perspective more. So, what I say is that India sees the string of pearls as more than just an economic initiative, right? It believes that China's growing network of ports around the Indian Ocean could eventually support military operations, increasing Beijing's strategic influence in India's neighborhood and potentially challenging India's security and regional dominance. I mean, considering what you said, I think this is the only reason I could figure out for India.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, Sambhav. Thank you so much. I was also wondering, uh, in India's perspective, it is very true that that the China could use these ports and try to encircle India. And in terms of this, why do you think China would want to do this?
Bro, look, take it this way, right? India is viewing this with a great caution, right? It believes that China's expanding network of ports could, serve those military purposes, as I said, which also, like, allowing Beijing to project power close to India's coastline. But I also say like India is sort of concerned that this growing influence in the neighboring countries such as like Pakistan and Sri Lanka could sort of reduce India's strategic influence in the region. As the result, India has strengthened its own partnerships and invested in strategic ports and naval cooperations through its necklace of diamonds strategy to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. What else do you think?
I actually agree with you, Sambhav. That's super duper interesting. And thank you so much for this addition. Mr. Demir, what do you think about it?
Personally, I think even though there are potential choke points in Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, I think China's initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a worthwhile policy. And myself being a Bangladeshi, I don't have the Indian perspective per se, but I think China in trying to pursue this initiative has experienced long-term growth. It has experienced the macroeconomic growth, which will allow it to become and allowed it to become a global power. So I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a very worthwhile and great policy.
Uh, So by now, it's clear why the Indian Ocean has become one of the most strategically important regions in the world. It's not just a big body of water, that's where billions of dollars worth of trade happen every year and cross across the waters. And this we know is because of both China's productive capacity and the other manufacturing countries in Asia, as well as the import and exports between major powers and European countries and Asian countries around the world. So, considering this, we need to think about why it's super important that no major regional power can afford to lose control over the Indian Ocean. And we know that China has already expanded its presence through the Belt and Road Initiative and what many call the string of pearls around India. However, India has not been standing quiet. They have also been developing a strategy of its own. Rather than building a vast network of overseas infrastructure, India has instead focused on strengthening partnerships, securing access to key ports, and deepening relationships with countries across the Indian Ocean. And this approach has come to be known as the necklace of diamonds. And what exactly makes up the India's necklace of diamonds, and how does it differ from China's strategy, and perhaps most importantly, how has China responded? We'll first start off with Sambhav explaining what the India's necklace of diamonds really is. And before he begins, I'll just name you a few ports. We have the Chabahar port in Iran, then we have the Mauritius port, then we have the Seychelles port, Seychelles military infrastructure, the Duqm port, the Sabang port, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, as well as Adani's port in Israel.
Okay. So, it was pretty natural that how did India respond on what is India's necklace of diamond, right? So, what I would say is the necklace of diamond is a strategic concept used to describe India's network of ports, new naval facilities, military partnerships, and diplomatic relationships across the Indian Ocean. Unlike China's Belt and Road Initiative, it's not a single government funded infrastructure program with a dedicated budget or official blueprint. Instead, it represents India's broader strategy of strengthening its presence in key maritime locations to safeguard its economic and security interests. The name Necklace of Diamonds comes from the idea that each strategic location or partner country acts like a diamond on a necklace surrounding the Indian Ocean. These include posts such as Chabahar in Iran, defense partnerships with countries like Mauritius and Mauritius, and like India's own naval bases, particularly in Andaman and Nicobar Islands near the Strait of Malacca. Together, these locations allow India to monitor important shipping lanes, respond quickly to maritime threats, and maintain a strong presence in the region. The strategy is built around three main objectives. First, to protect India's trade and energy routes, as nearly all of India's international trade by volume travels by sea. Second, it's to strengthen partnerships with neighboring countries through defense cooperation, infrastructure, and development. Also, the third and the last reason is to balance China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean without directly matching China's massive infrastructure spending. In simple terms, while China's string of pearls focuses on building ports and infrastructure across the region, India's necklace of diamond kind of focuses on building strategic relationships, enhancing naval capabilities, and ensuring that the Indian Ocean remains secure and open for trade. That's all I would say.
And now China saw this unofficial policy, the necklace of diamonds from India, and China decided that it was not going to falter, it was not going to radically change its policy, it was going to continue with the Belt and Road Initiative. As in response to India's necklace of diamonds, China decided to continue pursuing long term economic growth by improving their infrastructure. But they also realized that in order to coexist with India, they must do some aspects of diplomacy. And so they started communicating and enacting diplomacy with India in order to make it so that not that they can both be in full on conflict, but so that both countries can coexist with their routes and their various trade routes in and around the area. So, in response, China decided to continue its Belt and Road Initiative and decide to enact some aspects of diplomacy with India in order to coexist.
That was super duper interesting as you sort of showcased the basics of China's perspective, and that was interesting how you began a very interesting conversation. But before we talk about that, there's also one of the most underrated moves that India has made, and how that is an even in the Indian Ocean. And that was in 2022 when the Adani Ports and Special Economic Zone, together with Israel's Gwadar Group, acquired a controlling stake in Port of Haifa for about $1.18 billion. And that's up to until 2054. At first glance, it looks like a commercial investment. It's from the private sector. What has the Indian government got to do with this? But strategically, it's a lot bigger. Because Haifa sits on the Mediterranean Sea, close to the Suez Canal, meaning cargo arriving from India through the canal can be distributed into Europe. And this also directly ties into the proposed India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC. And you can think of it like this: we have India sending cargo to the UAE, then to Saudi Arabia, then to Jordan, then to the port of Haifa in Israel, and then to Europe. And instead of relying slowly on the traditional maritime routes that are already influenced quite significantly by China's Belt and Road Network, India is trying to create an alternative Eurasian trade corridor, and the government is actually needs to give permission for Adani to uh, purchase such major ports overseas, and of course, India would give permission for such a key uh, access. And then we also have the Shabahar port, India's Shabahar port in Iran versus China's Gwadar port. And we know how China invested heavily in Gwadar port, and India, as a counter move, invested heavily in Shabahar port. And they're only 170 kilometers apart. And that's crazy. Why? Because Pakistan blocks Indian overland access to Afghanistan, and Shabahar lets India reach Afghanistan, Central Asia, and future Eurasian markets without relying on Pakistan. So it's India's answer to China's China-Pakistan economic corridor. Then we have the Great Nicobar Island, which is one of the longest strategic project, and it has also invested billions of dollars in developing it. Because why? Because it's very close to the western approaches of the Strait of Malacca. And that's right, India also has dozens of islands, like the islands in Indonesia, right below, next to Sri Lanka, and it's right in front of the entryway into the Strait of Malacca, which is heavily controlled by China. And if China were to strip out or cut out India's ports and main straits, then India also has the ability to cut out the trade that goes through the Strait of Malacca, which is almost 75 to 80%. And that would be great leverage for India. And there are many other ports like this, and how India has responded to China. However, we know that China has also immense resources and funds, and has in fact expanded outside of Asia and has also moved to Africa. For instance, we know how China has purchased many mines, purchased many ports, purchased and invested heavily in infrastructure across many countries in Africa. And this is actually long term strategic partnerships as well. And before we move on to segment number five, which is the economics behind the rivalry, I was just wondering, is there anything else anyone else would like to add to the segment or to China's reaction? I guess that's a no, no problem. So then let's move on to segment number five, the economics behind the rivalry. So for this segment, I'll be asking you guys a very interesting question. So let me think. Okay, so we have spent a lot of time talking about the ports and military strategy. And I just wanted to start with the energy security. Since we know that China imports the majority of its oil uh, through the Indian Ocean, how important is energy security in driving both China's and India's strategies? Let's start off with Damir.
Yes, thank you. I would say that energy security, since both nations import a large majority of their oil, is very important, and especially in these trying and modern times, as we know that the energy crisis, potential energy crisis, which we may face due to the Strait of Hormuz's blockage, is not omnipotent. We may see drastic consequences because of energy. So one thing I was actually wanting to discuss is both of these strategies are very susceptible to international oil crisis or international fuel crisis. So my question is, and in response to Supreet, is that I think both of these nations need to find an alternative. They need to either switch to renewable energy or they need to find another way to generate energy. As if you're relying on imports for most of your energy, it is obviously a potential risk. As because if one blockade happens in terms of a strait or global conflict arises, we can see that your importing of oil as a strategy would be faulty, as it would cost so much to import and it would result in cost push inflation, and it can have drastic economic consequences. So I think an alternative route for energy needs to be identified for both countries in order to fully realize the fruits of these policies.
That was a fabulous answer. Thank you so much, Mr. Demir. And for Sambhav Maurya, our guest speaker, I also have another question for you. Is there a danger that countries accepting these investments become economically dependent on one major power? Or do these projects genuinely create long term economic development? Because we have also seen Sri Lanka's debt with China and the crises they faced. And many critics have also referred to China as a major loan shark disguised as a friend in the past. What do you stand on this? And of course, we'll also ask Mr. Demir Hossain what he believes on this investment idea.
Okay. To answer this question, I would say this is probably one of the most debated aspects of the Belt and the Road Initiative. On one hand, these projects can bring real economic benefits. Like many developing countries have long struggled with inadequate infrastructure, and Chinese financing has helped build ports, highways, railways, and these power plants that might not have been possible otherwise. Better infrastructure can attract investment, create jobs, boost trade, and support long-term economic growth. On other hand, critics argue that these investments can create financial dependence. If countries borrow more than they can realistically repay, the most frequent cited example would be the Sri Lankan Hambantota port, I think, right? The project was financed largely through Chinese loans, but the port generated very less revenue compared to the cost. As Sri Lanka faced mounting debt, it agreed in 2017 to lease the port to a Chinese company for 99 years in exchange for much needed funds. This case sort of became a symbol for critics who argue that some BRI projects leave countries with unsustainable debt and increased Chinese influence. Because of cases like the Sri Lankan port, some critics have labeled China as a loan shark disguised as a friend, arguing that Beijing uses loans to expand its geopolitical influence. However, China strongly rejected this characterization. Beijing argues that the vast majority of BRI projects have supported development, that their problems have multiple causes, not just Chinese lending, and the participation in the initiative is voluntary. So the reality is more nuanced. The success of these projects often depend on whether they are economically viable or how transparently they are managed and whether borrowing countries can sustainably service their debt. When planned well, infrastructure can become a powerful engine for growth, and when projects are poorly planned or financed, they can become a significant financial burden. That's what I would say.
I would say that, in agreement with Sambhav, that it is a bit nuanced, as because we have seen extreme examples on both sides of China's infrastructure development in these less economically rich countries work well and work horrible. But I would say that it's a good investment, and it can, if done properly, which mostly I think it has, it's a very sound idea, as China is offering their infrastructure and their knowledge in exchange for funds being paid back. And even though there are examples like the Sri Lankan one, I think the long-term economic growth and the potential for that growth very heavily outweighs the current um, problems that the country would face. As even though the country may be facing economic problems now and paying China back for the infrastructure, in the long run, that infrastructure which was implemented can and will eventually lead to long-term growth. So I think it is a very good idea to be economically dependent on China for these less economically diverse countries for for a specific amount of time. Now, if you end up staying economically dependent for a long period of time, obviously it's not good. But I think it is worth the risk, I would say.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sambhav Maurya and Demir Hossain, for answering these questions. What you've answered to what you guys have added to this conversation is truly invaluable. Thank you so much. And I also have one more question in this segment before we move on to the final segment. If countries can choose between Chinese financing, Indian partnerships, Western backed initiatives, and regional development banks, does that create greater economic opportunities, or does it force smaller nations into increasingly difficult geopolitical balancing act? And we also have Mr. Damir Hussain, who can talk about Bangladesh as a case study, because it's being forced to balance the relationship between the three: Pakistan, China, and India. So first, let's hand off the question to Sambhav.
Okay, so I mean, wait, can you like repeat the question because your voice
It's in the
cracked in the
chat.
middle.
It's in the chat.
Oh, did I not answer that already?
No, it's in the chat here.
Wait, if countries can now choose this one,
Yes.
you tagged Demir on this. Are you good?
Oh, sorry. It's. Oh no, that was before. I tagged him in before.
Wait, I'll answer. Okay.
Okay.
Just let me know when to start.
Sure. You can start whenever you want.
Okay. So, I mean, in many ways, it's a bit of both. On the positive side, having multiple partners, it sort of gives developing countries more options than ever before. Instead of relying on a single source of funding, governments can choose between Chinese investment, Indian partnerships, or Western-backed initiatives or financing from regional development banks. This competition can lead to a better infrastructure, more favorable financing terms, and greater bargaining power for smaller nations. However, these choices also come with challenges. As competition between major powers intensifies, infrastructure projects are no longer viewed as purely economic. They have become geopolitical as well. A decision to partner with one country can sometimes be interrupted as aligning with its broader strategic interests, making it more difficult for smaller nations to remain neutral. Many countries today don't actually want to choose a side. Instead, they are pursuing what's often called strategic balancing, working with China on trade and infrastructure, cooperating with India on regional security, and maintaining economic ties with Western nations at the same time. This allows them to maximize economic benefits while avoiding excessive dependence on any one power. Ultimately, whether this competition becomes an opportunity or a burden depends on how effectively these countries manage their relationships. If they can balance competing interests wisely, they stand to gain from increased investment and development. But if geopolitical rivalry begins to outweigh economic operations, they may find themselves caught in the middle of competition they never intended to join.
Yeah, building on what Sambhav said, I think that it's clear this idea of strategic balancing, where you can try to balance from multiple nations, multiple perspectives. I think this is a viewpoint which is slowly becoming less and less possible in the modern day due to growing political tensions and overall volatile state of geopolitical ness in the world. I think it's becoming more and more clear that as a smaller developing nation, you have to choose a side. You have to choose China, you have to choose India, you have to choose US, you have to choose whatever. But I think it does create greater economic opportunities because there are multiple examples of countries which have used these economic opportunities from larger nations, such as the Maldives, who they showed that a tiny nation can secure massive benefits by engaging multiple partners. It received over $1.37 billion from China for projects like the Sinamale Bridge and airport expansion. So we can see that it is possible to directly benefit, but again, it will take significant amount of time and it will lead to the developing country being in debt to the country it is gaining help from, whether that's India or China or maybe Western countries. But I think that it is becoming clear that in for some of point that strategic balancing is something that is going out of fashion, and that these smaller nations need to pick sides, they need to pick favorites, because then if they don't, they won't get any economic help. So yeah, that's what I believe.
Thank you so much, Zamir. That was very interesting and how you added further nuance into this discussion. But I was wondering whether you could talk about this with Bangladesh as our case study.
Yes. So moving on to Bangladesh. Bangladesh has tried to do strategic balancing where they are trying to benefit from Western, Indian, and Chinese perspective. They're trying to be on all three fronts. But then we're seeing that that's obviously becoming less and less possible as the Western relations as of 2026 have drastically changed in volatility. And we've also seen that in Indian and Chinese I guess balancing and strategic economic decisions, those are still there. But I think Bangladesh's strategy, given the economic situation of the world, is interesting because they have actually managed to balance out the three powers. Are able to, gain economic growth and gain economic ideals from these three countries without fully aligning themselves. But I even think Bangladesh, we will be forced to choose a side eventually. And I think that's interesting because it shows that we are truly in a changing state of the world. And it's just very interesting.
You're really right about the volatility and how uncertain global partnerships really are today. And thank you so much for employing Bangladesh in your case study. So, we've now talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, unpacked the string of pearls, examined India's necklace of diamonds, and looked at the economic forces driving this rivalry. But after everything we've discussed, it all comes down to one final question: who is actually winning? Is it China, with hundreds of billions of dollars invested across more than 150 countries and an unparalleled global infrastructure network? Or is it India, whose strategy relies less on massive investments and more on trusted partnerships, democratic institutions, and growing support from countries like in Europe, Japan, Australia, or Israel? And then what else can we add to this discussion? So, Samuel, let's start off with China. If we look purely at the numbers, China's scale of investment, the reach of the Belt and Road Initiative, and its growing economic influence across the developing world, would you say China currently holds a strategic advantage in this rivalry? And if so, what has it done better than India?
Okay. So to answer that, let's look purely at the numbers. Okay. It's fair to say that China currently holds the economic advantage. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure projects across more than 150 countries. Its financial capacities, speed of execution, and global reach are on a scale that India simply hasn't matched. China also has been very successful at filling a gap that many developing countries faced for decades, a lack of infrastructure financing. By funding ports, railways, highways, power plants, and industrial parks, China has expanded its economic influence while creating stronger trade, which links with countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and parts of Europe. Another area where China has outperformed India is speed and scale. Chinese state-owned banks and companies can often approve and complete major infrastructure projects much faster than many Western institutions or even India. This ability to deliver large scale projects quickly has made China an attractive partner for many developing nations. That said, scale isn't the only measure of success. India has taken a different approach. Rather than competing for dollar, it has focused on strategic partnerships, regional diplomacy, and building trust with neighboring countries. India's democratic governance, strong ties with countries like Japan, Australia, France, and United States, and its central locations in the Indian Ocean give it strength that can't simply be measured by investment figures. So, at the moment, China appears to have the upper hand in terms of economic reach and infrastructure investment, but whether that translates into long term strategic success is still an open question. The real outcome will depend not just on how much country invests, but on whether those investments remain economically sustainable, potentially accepted, and beneficial for partner countries over decades ahead.
Yes. So, but one thing I would like to elaborate on in terms of China is that it is clear that China got a head start on their economic policy, and that is very important because you see the state again, the state of the world in its major volatility will make it harder for India to pursue partners and to pursue this diplomacy because it's obvious that it's harder to communicate with multiple countries if there's so much tension. So because of that, I think the Chinese have gotten a major head start, and that since they've already very much well established their presence in these nations, I think China, unless there are major global supply shocks which would affect everyone, not just China, it would affect India as well. I think China have secured themselves as the country that is going to win because that infrastructure they've enacted allows the economic trade-offs of the opportunity cost for these smaller countries, and that makes these smaller countries in debt to China. And so, because of this, I think that we should continue. I think China will clearly ride into the sunset, so to speak, as the country with the economic advantage.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and it's really interesting how you mentioned the head start because that's very true. China was able to get into manufacturing a decade or so earlier than India, and now India, in terms of manufacturing output, is where China was a decade ago. And it's super interesting to see how this rivalry plays out because we know how, as of right now, in China, wages are getting higher, resources are becoming more expensive, and we know the impact and influence of the central governing authority over the nation, even though it is transitioned onto a more capitalist market. It's super interesting to see how the government still holds immense power in its internal policies and businesses. And adding on to this, it's super interesting to see how things will play out in the future as time goes on and as both countries are forced to compete against each other for deals and economic output and in general everything. So I wanted to ask Mr. Sambhav Maurya. We've spoken a lot about China's economic scale and infrastructure investments, but we know how influence isn't just built on investment alone. Where do you think India holds a strategic advantage? And could those strengths, especially being one of the largest democratic nations, as well as being a very open market, prove more valuable over the long term?
Okay, that's a really important point because isn't measured only by how much money a country spends. India's biggest strength is trust and partnerships. Unlike China, India generally positions itself as a collaborative partner rather than a major financier. It has built strong relationships with countries across the Indo-Pacific through diplomacy, defense cooperation, capacity building, and shared democratic values. Its partnerships with countries such as Japan, Australia, France, and the United Nations have significantly strengthened its strategic position. Geography is another major advantage. India sits at the center of the Indian Ocean, meaning it naturally overlooks some of the world's busiest shipping lanes. This gives India an advantage that no amount of overseas investment can fully replicate. It can monitor and respond to developments in the region such much more effectively than countries located further away. India also benefits from growing international confidence. Many countries see it as a stable, democratic alternative and reliable long-term partner, while China has undoubtedly expanded its economic influence. Some of its projects have faced criticisms over debt sustainability and transparency. India, by comparison, has generally focused on building long-term relationships and mutual cooperation. Could these strengths become more valuable over time? Absolutely. If countries increasing, if countries increasingly prioritize transparency, sustainable partnerships, and strategic trust alongside economic investment, India's approach could become even more attractive. At the end, long-term influence isn't just about who builds the most infrastructure. It's about who builds the strongest and most enduring relationships.
It's super interesting to hear about relationship and the strength of relationships, especially in this new global order of uncertainty, where we have seen how countries have sort of backstabbed each other and haven't gotten along as easily and as well as they have before. We now have America first or Europe first policies, and these policies are more anti-globalism, and it's super interesting to see how the world has been playing out as of right now. And I truly agree with you. It is very true how partnerships is super important, because if India is able to develop stronger partnerships, then even in such times of uncertainty, these partnerships could hold strong and be more beneficial for India in the long run. And next, I wanted to ask Demir, since we have spent a lot of this episode talking about competition, 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 does it really have to be a zero sum game? Could China and India achieve greater economic prosperity instead by cooperating with one another instead of competing for influence? And we know how China and India have cooperated in history, ancient history, back in the olden days, in ancient times. They were one of the best friends. They had one of the strongest trade markets in the world. And it's super interesting to see whether India and China could also be a counter to Western powers and Western influences.
I think Supreet has touched on a very interesting topic, because the capability of India and China as one would be massive, as because these are two of the biggest, if not the biggest, economic forces in the area, in the this part of the world. So if they were to cooperate, if they were to work together, we could see economic hubs be established in this side of the world, because these two nations have some of the fastest growing populations and some of the largest populations in the world. Thus, I think that it would be hugely beneficial for India and China to cooperate, because if they did, they could rival any other country, the Western countries, Europe, America, whoever, and then they would have so much power in terms of maritime trade routes and all this, and they could, use this massive influence they have already gained to increase, and they can use it to increase in other areas. And because of that, and because of the potential, I think it would be massively beneficial if these two countries were to have the same ideal and to align themselves with each other.
Thank you so much, Demir. And this really gets on to the most famous quote we have always heard: an eye for an eye makes the world blind. And I feel like these same core principles could apply to the same case. And I wanted to ask Mr. Sambhav Maurya, if we really believed in this friendship and this peace, then how should we India and China cooperate, and in which industries and sectors would this be feasible?
Okay. That's a great question to end on because it shifts the conversation from rivalry to possibility. The reality is that China and India, they don't have to see each other's growth as a threat. Both countries are among the world's largest economies, both have enormous populations, and both will play a major role in shaping global trade over the coming decades. While strategic competition is likely to continue, there are several areas where cooperation could generate far greater economic benefits than confrontation. One of the biggest opportunities is trade. Despite political tensions, China and India are already major trading partners. Reducing trade barriers, improving customs procedures, and expanding markets could increase bilateral trade, lower costs for business, and it can also create new opportunities for manufacturers and consumers in both countries. A second area is simply like supply chains and manufacturing. Rather than competing to dominate every stage of production, the two countries they can specialize in different parts of regional supply chains. China remains a global leader in advancing manufacturing and industrial production, while India has become increasingly competitive in pharmaceuticals, information technology, business services, and electronics assembly. A greater cooperation could make Asian supply chains more resilient and reduce costs for companies operating across regions. Energy is another major reason, as we discussed before. Both countries are among the world's largest importers of oil and natural gas. They share an interest in secure and affordable energy supplies and could collaborate on strategic petroleum reserves. Renewable energy technologies, cross-border electricity projects, battery manufacturing, and hydrogen research. Working together could also strengthen their bargaining power in global energy markets. There's also significant potential in technology and innovation. India has one of the fastest growing digital economies, while China has made major advances in areas such as electric vehicles, battery technology, renewable energy equipment, high speed rail, and manufacturing. These joint research, academic collaboration, and these private sector partnerships could accelerate innovation in sectors that are essential for future economic growth. Another promising area is climate and green infrastructure. Both countries face similar challenges, including rising energy demand, pollution, and the effects of climate change. Cooperating on power, wind energy, electric mobility, sustainable infrastructure, and climate adaptation would benefit not only China and India, but also contribute to global climate goals. Finally, both countries could work together to improve regional connectivity. Instead of developing competing transport corridors, there may be opportunities to coordinate infrastructure standards, simplify custom procedures, and enhance trade link across Asia. Better connectivity would reduce transportation costs, encourage investment, and it may also support growth throughout the region. Of course, none of this is easy. These are genuine disagreements over border issues, regional influence, and security that continue to shape the relationship. Those concerns can't simply be ignored. But history has shown that countries can compete strategically while still cooperating economically. If China and India can find a common ground in areas like trade, energy technology, healthcare, climate, infrastructure, these benefits could extend far beyond just these two countries. Given that together they account for more than one third of world's population, cooperation between them wouldn't just reshape Asia, it could reshape the global economy itself.
Thank you so much, Sambhav. This detailed explanation and exploration of how China and India could partner and how we could become stronger together is truly inspirational and brings me hope for the future of the world and for these two countries. And to conclude, I think this is one of the most perfect places to wrap up today's discussion because we've already explored China's BRI Belt and Road Initiative, unpacked the string of pearls, examined India's necklace of diamonds, and looked at the economic forces driving one of the most important geopolitical rivalries of the 21st century. But what becomes clear is that competition over ports or naval influence may not necessarily be the best option. And we know how this competition over trade, infrastructure, energy security, investment, and ultimately who shapes the future of the global economy can be done in a more mutual way. And whether China's strategy of large scale infrastructure investment or India's approach of strategic partnerships proves more successful is something only time will tell. But one thing is certain, the decisions made in the Indian Ocean today will have consequences that extend far beyond the region, affecting businesses, governments, and billions of people around the world. A huge thank you to our guest speaker, Sambhav Maurya, and our co-hosts, Mr. Demir Hossain and Mr. Zumar Sheikh, for joining us today and sharing your insights. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we're incredibly grateful for your time. And Mr. Sambhav, would you like to add anything else about the podcast?
I would just say, please like and subscribe. Dollar Dialogue is the best podcast I've ever known. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We love this guest speaker. And like he said, please do like and subscribe and be there to watch our next episode. Great game. China's String of Pearls versus India's Necklace of Diamonds with Sambhav Maurya. That's amazing. And this wraps up today's episode. Thank you to everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Dollar Dialogue, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell because we know we have a very good episode very with a very amazing guest speaker in 2 weeks. And until next time, I'm Supreeth Nagella. We have Demir Hossain. This has been Dollar Dialogue. Thanks for listening and goodbye for now.